Hi, you guys. So in this mini lecture, which probably should be a mini lecture, we're going to get the last two steps. We're going to cover steps 9 and 10. And 9 is, wait, let me bring you up to speed in case you haven't watched the last videos in a few hours or days, or if you didn't watch them ever, then it doesn't matter what I say now or not. Okay. So what we're trying to do is go over the 10 steps that brought us up to this idea of evolution by natural selection, the idea of evolution by natural selection, and then the steps that came after that to where we are now. So we are at step 9, which is occurring in the 1960s. And what we're doing is we're adding this concept of inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is a great concept, easy to understand. But before you can understand inclusive fitness, you probably have to understand regular fitness. So first of all, this idea of inclusive fitness, what is brought to you by Dr. William Hamilton. And Bill Hamilton was getting his PhD at Harvard, and whatever he was doing was so hard that the math professors at Harvard couldn't understand it. The guy was an intense math nut. Yeah. So I don't know, these slides got a little bit out of order. Don't worry, we'll go back to those. His first defense committee just said, no, this doesn't count as a doctorate because we can't understand it. Okay, that's how badass you have to be when the Harvard professors in the math department can't understand what you're talking about because math is too hard. So when the math got too hard, he revamped and he met up with a couple of biologists. And Hamilton is really famous in biology, but he was not a biologist. He was a mathematician. And he was so good at his job, he was actually pretty convinced he could understand where the origin of the HIV virus came from. And he went to East Africa in the hopes to hunt it down, because not unlike now, where even supposedly intelligent people are saying that that the coronavirus came out of a Wuhan laboratory, to which the people who actually study evolutionary trees and they look at the genes of the bats around Wuhan and they look at the coronavirus that came out of Wuhan, like, no, it's not laboratory made, it's bat made. And maybe somebody in that Wuhan laboratory caught a bat, and the virus was both in the bat and got into the lab by the bat. The virus is not lab made. The whole HIV AIDS thing, everybody thought that the AIDS virus was made, the HIV virus was made in a lab too, which turned out to be wrong. Was never had anything to do with a laboratory. Had to do everything to do with bushmeat. So anyway, what we're seeing now looks a whole lot like what we saw in the 80s. But anyway, Hamilton went to go find the origin of the HIV virus and caught malaria and died. Okay, I digress. So he is no longer alive, even though he would not have been a particularly old man. So let's go back a little bit. Okay, so before we talk about we talk about inclusive fitness, let's talk about classical fitness. So this idea about classical fitness is really very basic. I've got the definition there at the bottom. And the definition goes like this. The measure, we define classical fitness, or just fitness, as the measure of an individual's direct reproductive success in passing on genes to the production of offspring. You guys are going, what? Reproductive success? What's that mean? It's just a number of kids, right? So because for most mammals, for most things we study, plants get weird. Things that clone get weird. Bees, hymenopterans, weird. But most things that you meet on this planet are not weird. Well, not genetically weird. I mean, let's face it, a platypus is weird. An octopus, also weird. But neither here nor there. When we're talking about genetic weirdness, most, and by what I mean not weird things get half of their genes from their mom and half of their genes from their dad. So if you count how many children a creature has, then you can figure out how many genes go into the next generation. And evolution is all about getting the most genes into the next generation per unit exertion, right? Evolution is like the rest of us, a little lazy. It doesn't want to work hard to get genes into the next generation. It wants to get genes into the most genes into the next generation as easily as possible. And so when we're talking about just classical fitness or direct fitness, all we do is we count the number of kids that a creature has. So if this right here is your mama prairie dog, and oops, yeah, sorry. If that was your mama prairie dog, if this is your mama prairie dog and this is her baby, this baby is half related to her. So if we're counting all of her genes in the next generation, right now we're looking at half of her genes are represented in this baby. Okay, so when we say that classical fitness is the measure, that's your counting, of an individual's direct reproductive success, that means number of kids. An individual's number of kids is the same as the individual's direct reproductive success in passing on genes through the production of offspring. Just count the babies. Simple. Okay, so when we talk about inclusive fitness, it's a slight modification of that. Inclusive fitness is the same definition, the measure of an individual's direct reproductive success in passing on genes to the production of offspring and other relatives. So that means that we can count your nieces and your nephews. If you don't have any kids, you might not be an evolutionary dead end if your sister has a gazillion kids, or your brother has a gazillion kids, or even if your brother and sister each have 3 kids, you get represented in the next generation, even if you don't have any. And what Bill Hamilton did was show that mathematically. So I've made this very easy. You count the number of kids and you've got a measure of direct fitness. You count the number of kids and nieces and nephews and cousins and aunts and uncles, and you have your measure of indirect fitness. Simple, straightforward. We're going to go back to the numbers in a minute, but I want to go back to prairie dogs because I put prairie dogs in this for a reason. So the reason that we got into this, by we I mean scientists, got into, in evolutionary biologists, got into this idea of indirect and classical fitness had to do with prairie dogs. So what people were doing, I don't know if you guys have seen prairie dogs. I'm going to pretend that you are mostly New Yorkers and you haven't seen a prairie dog in the wild. But if you go west of the Mississippi, prairie dogs are everywhere. They're like in the medians between the highways. Any place you see any open space where a dandelion would grow here, a prairie dog is growing out west. All right. And fun fact, you know, the ferrets that you buy at pet stores, they are native North American animals, and they used to live all out west. They eat only prairie dogs. That's the only thing they eat. I guess they eat cat food because it isn't like anybody's feeding them prairie dogs in real life. Okay. So people are studying these prairie dogs, and here's the thing. Prairie dogs are like Snickers bars, right? They're like bite-sized deliciousness that ferrets like to eat, and snakes like to eat, and coyotes like to eat, and foxes like to eat, and every bird of prey wants to eat one. Okay, so if you're a prairie dog, do you know what you are? Paranoid. You're afraid that everybody is going to eat you because you're right. Everybody does want to eat you. And scientists noticed that sometimes prairie dogs do something very inexplicable. So if you're looking at a prairie dog town, so if you go out west far enough, you like looking at deserts, there's not a whole lot of grass around hiding stuff. And you're driving through, say, Yellowstone or any park in South Dakota. And you look out the window, you will see a gazillion prairie dogs, and they're called prairie dog towns because they look like prairie dog towns. And you see a clump of prairie dogs over here and over there and over there. And you're like, oh, how cute. And there's like everywhere. And you think, okay, well, go take a picture. So you go get out of your car with your camera and you take a step towards the prairie dogs, and somebody gives a scream and they all disappear down their holes. So you go from seeing a lot of prairie dogs to no prairie dogs. They're gone. Okay, so here's the thing that people notice. If a hawk is flying above the prairie dog town, sometimes a prairie dog will look up and scream, ah, and all the prairie dogs will dive into their tunnels. If you're the hawk, who do you think you're going to eat? You got all the choices of all the prairie dogs around. Who are you going to eat? You're going to eat the screamer, the one who went, ah, because you can hone in on that one. And people went and measured. Yeah, sure enough, the screamers got et more often than the ones who didn't scream. Why would a prairie dog ever scream? Why? Well, it turns out that prairie dogs scream only under very particular circumstances. If screaming can save enough of their relatives, they will scream. So if they have a bunch of their kids out playing and the hawk is above, they'll scream to save their kids. If they have even more of their nieces and nephews, they'll scream. If they have aunts, uncles, and cousins, they'll scream. If everybody who's out there is not a blood relative, do you know what the prairie dog does? Zips it. Doesn't say a word. And so this got people thinking, okay, so what's this prairie dog saving? Not just its own children, but she's, or he, saving their nieces and nephews and their cousins and their aunts and uncles. So this is what got Hamilton into thinking about the importance of counting fitness, not just as children, which is easier to do, but to count all your blood relatives, which is harder to do. Okay, I think that makes sense. All right, so let's talk about the math for a minute. You guys are like, oh no, not math, but no, it's pretty easy math. Okay, I'm me, you're you. You have all of your genes in you. They're unique. Nobody else has your genes, unless you're an identical twin, which you could be, or unless you're a clone, which you're probably not. Okay, so if I had an identical twin, which I don't, all of my nucleotides would be shared with my identical twin. That's what makes us identical. All of my ATCs and Gs that I have in me are also in my twin. We're essentially carbon copies. It's definitely even more true if we're clones, because we do that in the laboratory. It turns out that identical twins are just mostly identical, and there's a gradation of identicalness, but let's just leave that alone for now. Okay, if I'm a clone, I have like stepped into the Star Trek replicator. Now there are two of me. Okay, that means 100% of my genes that I have are in common with my clone. So if you look on here, we measure on this graph, we measure our genetic relatedness with the variable R. The R between me and my identical twin, or me and my clone, is 100% or 1. Okay, if I have a kid, I have two, but let's just talk about one kid. If I have one kid, that kid has half, okay, that kid was made with my egg and my husband's sperm. I know, gross to think about. Don't think about it. Just think about the egg and the sperm. Okay, I got an egg. All of my genes, 100% of my genes are represented potentially in an egg. But my child only gets half. The other half of my kid's genes comes from the dad. So my kid is exactly 50% related to me. My kid has half my genes. So if I have two kids, I have all of my genes on average represented. If I have more kids, I get more and more of my genes represented. You can only have 100%, but some of them are going to be duplicates. Okay, if I have a sister, a full sister or a full brother, that means that we have the same mom and the same dad. That means that potentially we're 50% related, but that is only an average, because the egg that made me and the egg that made my sister could be identical to each other or really similar to each other, or they could be incredibly different from each other. There is no promise that any of the eggs produced by my mom are going to be very similar to each other. They could be very different from each other. My mom could still make them. They don't have to be the same. And anytime you've seen it, you've seen like a family together and one kid looks like it doesn't belong in that group. You're like, oh, something went wrong there. Maybe, or maybe one of the eggs or one of the sperms was just really different, because that is a thing that can happen. So that means that siblings can be more than 50% related or less than 50% related. But on average, siblings share 50% of their genes. And so if you look on this graph, their parents and kids are exactly at 0.5, and full siblings are at 0.5 on average. Now I didn't put error bars in here to show exactly 50% related, plus or minus 0, which is what you would see for parents and kids, versus full siblings, which would be an average of 0.5 or 50% with a wide margin of error. Okay, and then as we go down relatedness, we just cut this in half. So grandparents and grandkids, they're 25% related. Uncles and nieces, or aunts and nephews, or aunts and nieces, or uncles and nephews, they are also 25% related to each other. We're just chopping it as half. Half siblings. So let's say that your parents got remarried and your mom had another kid. You are, instead of being 50% related to your, as you would be to your full sibling, to your half sibling, you are 25% related. We go down to first cousins, which is 0.125. So you're 12.5% related to your first cousins. By the way, if you're breeding expensive racehorses, or if you are marrying a human up until World War II, you can marry at 0.125 and lower without accumulating deleterious genes. So you don't have inbreeding problems as long as you stay at first cousins and lower. And you're like, oh, Pochron, that's gross. You're talking about incest. Well, incest isn't always a thing. Ancient Egyptians married brothers and sisters together too. And so did European royalty, although not usually brothers and sisters, but it's not unheard of, to keep the wealth together. But if you mate horses regularly at something closer than 0.125, something closer than first cousins, then you start getting, crooked eyes and all the other crazy shit you see in the European monarchy. Okay. So just to go over this graph one more time. On the x-axis, we have identical twins, clones, parents and kids, full siblings. On the x-axis, we have different relationships that you can have between relatives. And on the y-axis, we have our R, or our genetic relatedness. Our R can go down to something approaching 0. So if you were looking at somebody from Finland, which is at the top of the world, versus somebody from southern Argentina, which is at the bottom of the world, and you were going to ask how related they are to each other, it would be something smaller than 0.125, right? It'd be low, approaching 0. You could say not 0, because all humans have some genes in common, but it would be approaching 0. On the other hand, if we want to talk about the closest people could be related to each other, you are most closely related to your clone and your identical twin. Okay, and so you start with the closest relatives, you chop them in half, so parents and offspring are exactly 50% related to each other. Full siblings are also close relatives, but they're 50% on average. Grandparents and grandkids are 25% related to each other, or they have an R of 0.25, etc. Okay. Can always listen to that again slower if you got confused, but I believe in you. Okay. So that's step 9. Now we're going to talk about step 10, and we are almost done. Okay, so the last step we're going to give is 1967. I just want to tell you that if you want to hang out with nerds, I would actually add step 11, and I would put epigenetics on here for the reasons that I talked about earlier. I think epigenetics are a pretty important step, which is why I've included in this lecture. But we're going to stop right here at 1967. And we're going to talk about George Williams. Do you know where George Williams worked? Stony Brook University. He was actually a really nice guy. He was really kind and gentle, and he belonged to the National Academies of Science. And if you want to publish in the proceedings of the National Academies of Science, you have to get somebody who is a member to say, yes, this paper should be published. And George Williams helped me and my boss at the time get a paper published, which is pretty badass. If you look up George on, I haven't looked lately, but if you look on the Wikipedia page, there's a really funny story. So he should be famous for being an amazing scientist, and he is, but I think the Wikipedia page is a really funny story, although it's funny in a terrible way. So it turns out that there were some biology students at Stony Brook University who decided to feed a rabbit to a ferret and make a video of it after taking some animal behavior class. And of course, given what I talked about earlier in this presentation, you can imagine what would happen if you put a ferret and a rabbit together. The ferret is going to eat the baby bunny pretty quickly. And it was a bloody mess. And the ferret got fed and the bunny died. And the kids made a video of it. And then I don't know, they thought they were Perkins or somebody. They made a movie of it, and they made it into a videotape, and they stored it at the Mastic Library. And Newsday got a hold of it, and they were like, do you know what the students at Stony Brook University are doing? Because the students didn't have any permission to do this. They didn't know, they didn't tell any professors they were going to do this. And anyway, George was, Dr. Williams to you, and actually, and to me too, he was chair of the Ecology and Evolution Department at the time, and he got in so much trouble. And the newspaper called up and said, do you know what your students did? And to him, he was just like, yeah, they fed a ferret. but of course, you're supposed to have all sorts of permission before you feed a ferret. Okay, that's a funny story, but why am I talking about it? Not because somebody fed a bunny to a ferret on his watch and then made a video and stuck it in the Mastic Library. Why I'm talking about him is because he wrote this book in 1967. And when I was a graduate student in the 1990s, everybody had to read this book. And this book, it looks so old on here. I don't know if you can see, there's a bird on here, then the bird blends in very nicely with its leafy background, which is what he was talking about. And the name of his book was Adaptation and Natural Selection. And the thing about this book, the reason that I'm including George here as the final step is because in writing this book, he took all of this complicated stuff and he made it accessible for professors and graduate students and even the ambitious undergraduate student. So he made 3 aspects super clear in 1967. And let's talk about this for a minute. The first thing that he did was he translated Hamilton's math, the math that I explained to you for step 9, into something that everybody could understand. Because Hamilton's math, man, nobody could read that shit. It was hard. But Williams could read it, and he did, and he turned it from math into English in his book. I hope you like this joke. I was going to tell a joke about sodium, but nah. Okay, it does imply that you know that the elemental code for sodium is Na, which of course you knew. I like looking at the math on the back of these memes. It's got milk and cheese and rats. Okay. The next thing that he did is not so different than what Lorenz and Tinbergen did, and that he was really interested in making sure that, oh, it's late, sorry, that scientists had a good standard for when they can evoke adaptations. Because not only were like Nazis saying that things were adaptations, but people who should know better were invoking adaptations, and they were really self-serving and stupid. Okay, but before I read the definition, do you like Darwin's Finch's jokes? Can I copy your homework? Yeah, just change it up a bit so it doesn't look obvious you copied. That's funny. It's a nerd joke. Okay, so this is a quote out of that book there. Hypotheses about adaptations are, in essence, probability statements about why a reliable, efficient, and economic set of design features couldn't have arisen by chance alone. So Williams wrote this book because also at Harvard there were these two other guys who were really busy trying to say that evolution was bullshit. They were trying to say that nothing as complicated as, say, an eyeball could evolve via natural selection. And their argument was that, you know, if you look at an eyeball, it's got this lens and an aperture and a retina, and it's connected to your brain. How is natural selection ever going to make such an adaptation? And Williams was like, yeah, natural selection can make an eyeball. And in fact, I don't think anybody doubts that I mean, except for the nut jobs who don't think that that evolution and adaptation are a real thing. But then no amount of evidence is going to convince those people. But that's a conversation for a different day. In fact, it's probably my next mini lecture. Okay. So what he's trying to say here in this quotation is that if you're going to talk about natural selection causing an adaptation, what you're really doing, you can't really prove it exactly neatly every single time. But what you're doing is you're putting forward a hypothesis. And your hypothesis is talking about how a specific kind of design features, right? So if we take an eyeball, it's reliable. Your eyes generally work. It's efficient. It might be one of the best ways to make sure that you can interpret your environment around you. It's reliable, it's efficient and economic are mostly the same thing. Set of design features that couldn't have arisen by chance alone. Okay, so there had to be selection pressure so that you could detect and sense and understand your environment. And eyeballs are one way to do that. It's not the only way to do that, right? So things like platypuses live in muddy water. They can't see where shit because the mud in the water, the water is super murky and filled with tannins. I said mud, but it's really tannins. And so platypuses don't invest in great eyeballs. They have kind of crappy vision, but instead they have evolved electroreception, where they are like sharks and then they send out little electric pulses out of their bill, and those electric shocks travel out and travel back. And so it's like electric sonar. That's what platypuses have on their face. By the way, sharks do that too. So clearly it behooves organisms to be able to sense their environment around them. And one way to sense the environment around them is eyeballs. Okay, what's the third thing that our friend George did? He squashed this super prevalent idea about group selection. Okay, group selection is a pain in the ass. Okay. Um, Group selection, I've got the definition right up there at the top. Group selection theory states that an organism might limit its reproduction, might hold back on the number of kids it has in order to keep the population low, thus keeping resources available for everybody else. So earlier I was talking about herbivore, and we're going to read Monkeys in the Garden, which is about herbivore. And when Irv DeVore first started working in the field of animal behavior, because that is what he was most interested in, he used a group selection model. And in fact, when I went to go interview him, I had, I think I got it in the stack of books behind me. I had his book, and I'm reading it in preparation for this interview, and it's filled with group selection models. Okay, what's a group selection model look like? Okay, so Irv studied baboons, and he went out to the field and he's looking at adult male baboons, and he puts forth this idea that says that some baboon could have more kids but decides not to, so that other baboons can have more kids. Oh, if I have kids, I'll use up the resources and then you can't have kids, so I'll hold back. Okay, no, that's stupid, right? Because evolution is going to say, okay, that one held back on having kids. Well, that one did. So me and my genes and my family are going to be selected against because I didn't get kids into the next generation, right? It's a dumb idea. It's mostly a dumb idea. I'm giving it to you in the most simplistic terms. There is at least one guy out there who finds a time and a place for group selection. But for the most part, anytime somebody says, I'm holding back for the good of the group, that's usually bullshit. Okay. If you hear this idea that only groups that act selflessly will survive, it doesn't withhold common sense thinking it through, because if I'm going to sacrifice myself so that you can have a kid, I'm not going to have a kid so that you can have a kid, then natural selection is going to act against me, and the next generation is going to be filled with people who are going to have kids, right? Okay, so it was G.C. Williams, George, who squashed this idea of group selection, which was really prevalent at the time. So my friend Irv DeVore, he didn't learn this from Williams, he learned it from Trivers, but Trivers taught it to Williams, and then Williams helped popularize this idea. Okay, we're done. We did all 10 steps. So these are the 10 steps, just as a reminder. The first thing, step 1, we had Erasmus Darwin, who was suggesting that life is very old after looking at fossils. We have Malthus, who suggests that populations grow faster than their resources, which implies competition. We have Lamarck, who suggested that parents pass useful traits onto their offspring, but he also suggested this idea that organisms come to fit their environment. He wasn't using the word adaptation, but that's what he was seeing, that organisms become adapted to their environment. Okay, step 4 was the Victorian observations that that traits tend to look similar. Remember the hands. So bats have hands, whales have hands, cats have hands, humans have hands. If you look at the structure, really similar. And then we have step 5, where we've got Wallace and Darwin are presenting at the Linnaean Society, and they're giving us this idea of evolution via natural selection. We've got Mendel, who outlined the rules of heredity in his genetics paper. We have the modern synthesis in the 1930s, where people are putting Mendel and Darwin and Wallace together to understand that the part about heritability that Darwin and Wallace were all hepped up on didn't make sense until we understood that genes were inherited as packets. And then we have ethology, which is this idea that natural selection can work on behavior. We have inclusive fitness, which should make it clear that you can count not just the number of kids that you have, but the number of grandkids, the number of nieces, the number of nephews, the number of cousins. And then we have G.C. Williams, who's giving us who's clarifying a lot of these really complicated ideas and making it accessible in 1967. Okay, so at this point, most of you, if you followed all of these and you've done your study guides, you guys are ready for the exam on this. But most of you guys have a pretty sophisticated understanding about natural selection and evolution. Good job. Okay, I have one more lecture, I think, before the exam. All right, I'll see you guys later.